Thank you for that very nice introduction, Professor Sandler, and thank you, President Crowell, for welcoming me here. Anthony, I have to say, is one of the great unsung heroes of the Bloomberg administration. He really was there at critical moments in the administration to make sure that problems got solved. He also, by the way, was the person who would vet individuals who were being appointed by the mayor, and I remember the conversation with him, including the question, what is the most embarrassing thing that's ever happened to you? And imagine that being written on the front page of the New York Times. Tell me what it is. That was a short conversation, fortunately, but he was always looking out for people's best interests. You know, over the past several years, I've spent a fair amount of time discussing how to keep New York City competitive. And though we certainly face very significant challenges, short-term economic and geopolitical uncertainty, long-term investment by competitor cities and nations, under Mayor Bloomberg, we have actually made substantial strides in turning New York City into what we like to refer to as the capital of 21st century innovation. In the last 5 years, for example, technology employment in New York City has increased by nearly 30%, and today there are almost 120,000 people employed in the 5 boroughs in this critical sector. There's been significant growth in industries like film and television production, tourism, and just in the last year, we have been named the most competitive urban economy in the entire world by not one, but 4 publications, including A.T. Kearney, Euromoney, The Economist, and people may discount this one, Bloomberg as well. But despite this very impressive record, in October of last year, we were reminded once again that not all of New York City's challenges come from the competitive environment. That reminder came in the form of Hurricane Sandy. And the impact of that storm was dramatic, to say the least. At the peak, the storm surge at the Battery was almost 14 feet high. Over 1,100 homes in New York were yellow tagged, 800 homes were red tagged, and hundreds were recommended to be demolished. And total losses to the city's economy, including assets and lost economic activity, came to almost $19 billion, and that's before taking into account losses to the Port Authority and the MTA. Of course, more important than all of this, thousands of New Yorkers lost irreplaceable family heirlooms, while dozens of New Yorkers lost their lives. But notwithstanding the unprecedented scale of the storm, as the storm approached the city, the mayor mobilized city government. First, of course, to secure life, to ensure that critical basic services were brought back online, and later to help people with the initial recovery efforts, assisting New Yorkers to get back on their feet and get their lives back together. Whether that was through the city's rapid repairs program, which has now made over 10,000 homes habitable again, or through the work of the Department of Sanitation, which removed over 350,000 tons of debris in just a matter of weeks. Typical of Mayor Bloomberg, though, even as our recovery efforts were still underway, he realized that as painful as the experience of Sandy was, it also presented us with an opportunity. An opportunity both to look back at the performance of city government and see where we succeeded and where there's room for improvement, and to look forward and to figure out how to make our city more resilient in the face of an uncertain future. So on December 6th, Mayor Bloomberg stood before civic leaders and called on his administration to develop 2 reports in a short time frame. One was an after-action report, which would look at the performance of city government in the recent storm. That was to be headed by Deputy Mayor Gibbs and Deputy Mayor Holloway, and that report is expected to be released in the coming few weeks. The other is a plan that grew out of 3 observations that were made by Mayor Bloomberg. The first observation that the mayor made was that as we recover from Hurricane Sandy, we can't just think about the short term. We also have to think about the medium term and the long term. The second observation that the mayor made was, though we have to focus on the neighborhoods in the city that were particularly impacted by this storm, we can't just focus on those neighborhoods. We have to think about this impact citywide. And the third observation that he made was that we can't just think about Hurricane Sandy. In fact, we can't just think about hurricanes. We have to think about climate change more broadly. And that's why the administration is now working on a long-term plan for how, post-Sandy, our city should not just rebuild, but to transform itself so that it will be more resilient in the face of the likely impacts of climate change going forward. And what I'd like to spend my time this morning talking to you about is how we plan to achieve that. It's first important, though, I think, to note that this plan is not being created out of whole cloth. In fact, we already have a very solid foundation. In 2007, Mayor Bloomberg released his groundbreaking Plan YC, which not only set forth aggressive goals for the city relating to the causes of climate change, like, for example, reducing greenhouse gas emissions in New York City to a level 30% below their levels in 2005 by 2030, a goal, by the way, which we are now about halfway through achieving, but also put forward a long list of adaptation-related initiatives on which the administration has been focused in the years since. And since the report, other agencies, from the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability to the Department of Transportation to the Department of City Planning, Department of Environmental Protection, and many others, have created detailed adaptation and resiliency blueprints, which have become national and international models. Our goal with our new plan is to build on all of this work. So, what will our report address? The plan is for our report to address 3 questions that Mayor Bloomberg has posed to us. The first question is a retrospective question, asking, with respect to Hurricane Sandy, what happened? Now, of course, all of us, on a certain level, know what happened. Our goal, though, is not just to create an anecdotal picture of the impact of the storm, but to gather hard data that allows us to bring the story together in a coherent and comprehensive manner. And I think this is even more important, we also aim not just to learn what happened, but why it happened, which is critical to making changes as we move forward. The second question posed by Mayor Bloomberg, meanwhile, is a prospective question. It asks the following: while Sandy has come and gone and never will return again, something is clearly changing in the environment around us that we have to address. For example, in the last 3 decades alone, the sea level around New York City has risen by several inches already. As a result, the question we must ask is, what is the future likely to look like in New York given these changes? And we're going to ask that question both in the medium term, which we're defining as the 2020s, and in the long term, which we're defining as the 2050s. And we're going to ask that question both in a steady state, when there are no storms, no heat waves, no droughts, but just sea levels that are X feet higher than they are today, and in acute situations, when those storms, those droughts, those heat waves actually are occurring. And as I will describe for you shortly, this work is going to be based on the best available science. The final question that was posed to us by Mayor Bloomberg is the so what question. So what do we do about all of this? In answering that question, we are going to look not just at the neighborhoods that were devastated by the storm and come up with rebuilding plans that make those neighborhoods safer and smarter and better than they were before, but we're also going to be looking citywide at our critical systems and infrastructure and asking, where are the vulnerabilities to these systems and infrastructure in the new world in which we will be living? Now, as is typical of Mayor Bloomberg, expectations are high and timeframes are short. We've been asked to deliver our final report by May of this year, and therefore we are well into our efforts to produce the report. For example, we've assembled a team of some 30 professionals from both the public and private sector who are already busy putting together the data that we need in order to help us to assemble our plan. The group that we've assembled is divided largely into two subgroups, one of which is focused on critical systems and infrastructure, and they're developing detailed plans to mitigate the likely impacts of climate change on these systems and infrastructure, focusing on everything from telecom to energy to housing and commerce. And then we have a second group, which is focused on developing plans for the Sandy impacted areas. Their focus is on the neighborhoods where there is the greatest lingering physical impact in the city. And the areas that they're looking at, I'm sure won't surprise any of you, but it includes the south and east shore of Staten Island, southern Queens, including the Rockaways, Broad Channel, and Howard Beach, southern Brooklyn, the Coney Island area, the Brooklyn and Queens waterfront from Sunset Park to Newtown Creek, and the southern part of Manhattan. A critical part of the effort of these teams has been outreach. And to this day, after only about 6 weeks in operation, we've already met with 51 elected officials and their staff, including 6 more meetings that we're going to be having today, and representatives of 45 different community groups. And of course, because this is the Bloomberg administration, as mentioned, underlying all of our work is going to be the best available science with key input from the New York City Panel on Climate Change, which is a group that was set up through Plan YC that includes leading academics from CUNY, Columbia, Princeton, and elsewhere in the field of climate change and what it likely means for our planet. Meanwhile, we're also making substantial progress on actually answering the questions that were posed by the mayor. In December, for example, we hired McKinsey and Swiss Re, a large reinsurance company who, because of its business, has actually been focused on the implications of climate change. And we've asked them to pull together information working with the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability and others to determine what happened during Sandy and why. And let me give you a couple of examples of what we've learned. As you can see on the screen, what we've pulled together is a chart here of the percentage of gas stations in New York City that were open in the days after Hurricane Sandy. Those are in the dark blue at the bottom of the graph. And what you can see from that is that a very small percentage were open immediately after the storm. The number actually climbed significantly. A nor'easter came, which some people probably don't even remember, right after Hurricane Sandy. The number declined again, and then it increased in waves until it hit a level that was basically a steady state. That's interesting. But what I think is actually more interesting is a chart that was pulled together by the Mayor's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability, where they mapped out the entire supply chain that brings fuel to New York City and figured out where the breaks in the supply chain occurred that led to the shortages in fuel. Was it the port that was closed, pipelines, refineries, the lack of power? This is the information that we're going to be able to use as we figure out how to make that supply chain more robust going forward. Similarly, we also looked at the inundation areas in the city and took a look at the built environment, asking how old were the buildings in these inundation areas. And what you can see is that about 84% of the buildings in the inundation area were built before 1983, which is a critical year because that's when the building code changed. What's more interesting than that, though, is that of the red-tagged buildings in the city, 95% of them were built before 1983, which leads us to believe that the changes in the building code actually did what they were supposed to do. That is, newer buildings were proportionally safer than older buildings were. Again, very important information as we figure out how to rebuild and recover from this storm. Another area where we're making progress is on the second question that the mayor asked of us, namely projections about the future. And here, a very big part of the work that we're doing has been coordinating with FEMA, which is updating their insurance rate flood maps. Now, this may sound like an obscure topic, but it's actually extraordinarily important, and let me explain why. These maps were last updated in 1983, which is not a coincidence. That's also when the building code was updated. And what they show is where, in the yellow on the screens, there is a 1% chance in any given year that you are likely to experience flooding in your home or business. And in the gray area, what they show is where there's a 0.2% chance of being flooded in any given year. What that means in the yellow area is that if you have a 30-year mortgage, there is a 26% chance that during the term of that 30-year mortgage, your home will be flooded. And that's relevant because these maps are largely used to determine who is required to get flood insurance with federally backed mortgages. So as it turns out, based on experiences of Irene and Sandy, it became clear to FEMA and many others that these maps needed to be updated. In fact, in Hurricane Sandy, as you can see here in red, the flooding occurred well outside of the 100-year floodplain. The area that you see that is in yellow is the area of the floodplain, you saw the floodplain on the previous slide, and the area in red shows that much more of the city was actually flooded during Hurricane Sandy. In fact, 44% of all red and yellow tag buildings in New York City were outside of the 100-year floodplain. Over 2/3 of the impacted residential units in New York City were outside of the 100-year floodplain. The good news is that FEMA had actually already begun to update these maps. However, because this work is very complicated, that work was likely not to be completed until about a year from now. But because of the severe impact of Hurricane Sandy and the need for people to rebuild with the best available information, FEMA has decided to release interim maps. Now, why are those interim maps important? Well, one thing that they won't do, and this is very important to understand, is they will not have the force of law, so to speak, in that they will not change who is required during this interim period to get flood insurance and who is not required to get flood insurance on federally backed mortgages. They are, in that respect, only advisory. But they will have enormous implications on our city. One, they will give a pretty good indication of where the final maps are likely to come out, and therefore will directionally show many people who are today outside of the floodplain that they are likely to be inside of the floodplain when the final maps are completed. Two, they likely will inform decisions by private insurers, not by the government-backed flood insurance program, but the insurers who largely insure commercial buildings. And you will probably see changes in rates and requirements as a result of that. And they're also likely to lead to interim changes in city zoning and building codes. Given this, we are working very hard with FEMA to ensure that these maps, when they come out, which we expect to happen very shortly, are as accurate as possible. These maps are also important because the information from these maps in turn are going to be fed into the work that we're doing with the New York City panel on climate change, which will help us not only to look forward. These maps are backwards looking. They say, based on the experience of the last X years, what do we think the floodplains look like? We want to ask, given the changes that we think are going to happen to the climate in the middle term and the long term, what do we think that the future is going to look like? But they won't only inform our projections about sea rise and storm surge. They'll also inform our projections about things like temperature, heat wave, drought, large areas of precipitation. And we want to make sure, though, with this information, that we in the Bloomberg administration and we as a city are thinking proactively rather than reactively. Though I would like to tell you that we're waiting for the conclusion of all of this analysis to begin to answer our third question, the so what question. The fact is that because of our compressed timeline, we have to actually answer all of these questions simultaneously. And so we're very hard at work already on developing this plan, working with elected officials, working with community groups. I'll have much more to say about what this plan will involve as the weeks progress. But what I can tell you today is 3 guiding principles that are helping us to organize the work that we're doing in establishing this plan. The first is that we recognize that we are never going to climate change-proof New York City. That is an impossible task and therefore is a foolish goal. However, we do believe that the loss of life, the damage, the interruption that was caused by Hurricane Sandy can be mitigated. And the work that we're going to do will attempt to put the city in a place where when future storms and future climate change occurs, we will be better prepared for those occurrences going forward. Second, as we develop our recommendations, we are intensely focused on implementability. Our goal here is not to create a vision document that will sit on a shelf. What we are looking to do is create an actionable plan with a roadmap for execution, along with timelines and benchmarks for achieving that plan. And third, which is related to the second principle, among our primary aims is to ensure that there are funding sources for the initiatives that we propose. Therefore, we're intensely working with the federal task force that's been set up by Secretary Donovan to allocate the federal funding to ensure both that New York City gets its fair share of federal money and to ensure that as we develop these programs are tailored to the requirements of the federal funding source. As I mentioned, Mayor Bloomberg has set out an ambitious agenda for us and given us a compressed timeline in which to meet the goals that he's set out. However, as Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Irene before it and numerous other events in recent days have shown, the imperative here is urgent and one that we ignore at our own peril. And I think actually that President Obama may have put it best in his recent inaugural address when he said, "We will respond to the threat of climate change, knowing that the failure to do so would betray our children and future generations." But here, I think there's some good news. Namely, we're all New Yorkers. And as challenging as our task may be, playing long odds is something that we actually do exceedingly well. Whether it's recovering from financial shocks or recovering from terrorist attacks, when others have told us that challenges are overwhelming, not only have we not succumbed, but we've succeeded, in some cases, beyond even our wildest imaginations. And that's the spirit in which we're addressing the challenge of Hurricane Sandy. Success here, of course, is never going to be absolute, and it's not guaranteed. But with a clear-headed and analytical understanding of the challenges that we're seeking to address, and smart, strategic, and timely investments, we can mitigate the risk, and once again, not only prove the naysayers wrong, but also establish for ourselves a leadership position on an issue that is of critical importance to the future of our planet. Thank you very much.